So I would like to introduce you to James Barrowman. James is a writer, a tour guide and hospitality worker. He has contributed poems and articles to the Scottish Left Review, Heckle, Notes from Below and The National, and he has come to talk about Peter Imandt, Dundee and the Paris Commune. So if you could join me in welcoming James.
Hello, thank you. I'll talk a little bit here about the sort of background here and why this is such a radical change in subject for my proposed talk. So, a little preamble. These are two photos I took in January at the bus station as I was leaving Dundee after 10 years studying here. Family circumstances moved me back to Cumbernauld earlier this year, and I had to take a step back from my doctoral project, which was looking at the Wedderburns. And around the same time, I was originally supposed to be giving a talk for you all at Abertay Historical Society, and sadly I had to postpone. So here I am, almost a year later, and after having to wind down my Wedderburn project, at least for now, I didn't really feel like talking about it as much, and I thought this was a good chance to return to another subject that I've written on during my time in Dundee. So the material in this talk is sort of bolted together from a few different projects I undertook while I was studying here. The first one being a paper I gave at the university's 2021 postgraduate conference, a common thread. At that time we were all still meeting on Zoom and still within the COVID years. So I chose to speak about the 150th anniversary of the Paris Commune and the sort of links between then and the time we were living through. Then last year I became aware of Peter Imandt and the 200th anniversary of his birth, and I just want to thank Heckle, which is a nice local online publication, for publishing my research into Imandt, and also thank the university and the Scottish Graduate School for Arts and Humanities for supporting me throughout that time. So here we go. So I'm going to start by talking about Peter Imandt, and then talk about a few other Dundonians that have connections to that period in between 1848 and 1871. Then talk a little bit about Dundee's response to the events of the Paris Commune in 1871, and then circle back round to Peter Imandt in later life. The title of this talk, Hunting a Red Wolf, comes out of the fact that Imandt was nicknamed the Red Wolf during his revolutionary years, and it's perhaps best summed up in a letter from Jenny Marx to Louise Wedemeyer in 1861, where she says, "Imandt is a married man in Scotland, Red Wolf a teacher in some god-forsaken spot, turned Philistine." And this sort of thorny question of what separates Karl Marx, the scholar and the sage, from Peter Imandt, the Philistine, is really interesting. They actually shared their beginnings. They both attended the Friedrich Wilhelm Gymnasium in Trier, a school that was known for birthing many radicals, many 48ers, and some of Karl Marx's schoolwork actually survives from this time, most notably an essay he wrote at 17, Considerations of a Young Man on Choosing His Career. In this piece, foreshadowing his later life, Marx concludes that a man's insufficient when he prioritises his own individual success above all else. He says, if he's working only for himself, he can become a famous scholar, a sage, a distinguished writer, but never a complete, a truly great man. So what did Peter Imandt actually get up to in 1848 to earn him this Red Wolf nickname. We only have to look so far as Marx's writing itself and work entitled Herr Voigt, which is often considered to be his forgotten work. He actually took a break from writing Capital to write this, and it's often thought of as a bit of a frivolous break, but you know, Marx was responding to accusations made against him by a man called Voigt, and this seemed to have an urgency at the time as something that would prevent the circle around Marx from spreading their message, and it seemed crucial. Here is what Marx says about Imandt and his closest comrade Shelley's activities. On the outbreak of the revolution, Imandt left university in order to take part as a volunteer in the war in Schleswig-Holstein. In 1849, Shelley and Imandt led the storming of the arsenal in Prüm, and from there they forced a passage to the Palatinate with their troops and the weapons they had seized. There they joined the ranks of the army of the Imperial Constitution. Having been expelled from Switzerland in the early summer of 1852, they made their way to London. Marx also publishes letters from each man that detail their activities. Imandt says, "I do not understand how Voigt could connect you with the affairs in Geneva. It was known among the refugees there that the only one of us who was connected with you was Dronke. More about him later." The Brimstone gang, who Voigt had made out to be some group of conspirators, had long winded down before Imandt was in Geneva. They existed before my time, and the only name I remember to them in relation to it is Borkheim. The Shelley letter goes into much more detail, and so he says, "It goes without saying that someone who never went to Geneva, or only arrived after the gang had been broken up, obviously never belonged to it. That is to say that it was a purely local flower, which only blossomed for a day, so that in this sublimate should really be called flowers of sulphur. However, and probably because of the revolutionary whiff, they probably smelled a little too strong for Swiss nerves. For Drury blew, and the flower was scattered to the four winds. It was only some time afterwards that Abt and several years after him, Cherval, came to Geneva, where each smelled after his own fashion, but by no means, as Voigt claims, like that bouquet which had long since been torn up and forgotten and had lost its perfume." Sort of perspectives on Imandt's actions and his own sort of value and worth to the revolutionary cause differed even amongst Marx and Engels, and this is evident in their letters, where they're often gossiping and speculating on the character of their colleagues, and no more so in one from 1852. Marx was impressed by Imandt's conduct in a stormy meeting concerning the financing of a new German publication, when an attendee named Dam constantly interrupted and wanted to rule Imandt out of order. While he read out a passage about the proletariat, a painter named Frank rose in indignation and said, "I can't stand it anymore, I grunt." Imandt quickly rebutted that this was something he had in common with other animals. Engels replied to this report by accepting that Imandt does pretty well for himself after his own fashion, but could not resist peppering in more condescension, describing Imandt as a deus minimorum gentium, a god of the minor nation and a house dog of German communism. Engels concluded that Imandt was useful, only with the caveat that we have now learned to keep lesser folk of this kind on a short terrain. Engels also refers to the swank and swagger of the Heise, Drunke, Imandt trio. And these were the three that actually settled in Scotland. Heisa, also in Dundee, at least for a time, is certainly the most mysterious of the three, and the one that I've been trying the hardest to find out more information about. Drumca ended up in Glasgow after a spell in Liverpool, and ironically, his name seemed to be fitting because most references to him in Marx and Engels' letters involve him being, red-faced with alcohol and a bit rambunctious. He certainly seems to be the one that both had the least time for, but Marx and Engels seem to differ quite substantially on that, alluded to, with Marx having quite a lot of affection for Imandt, and Engels being closer to Heisa geographically, having more respect for him than Imandt. Engels made further disparaging comments, saying how when Heisa used to call on Marx, he was never unchaperoned by that lout Imandt and that Philistine jackass Shelley. And in 1854, Engels struggled to conceal his contempt for Imandt again, when this trio here, were caught up in a legal complaint after Drumca, on a sort of rowdy night out, made some ill-advised pass at a married woman, and ended up in a sort of drunken, violent kerfuffle. Engels says, "It suits me very well that the swank and swagger of the Heisa Drumca Imandt trio should come to an inglorious end, for otherwise one would get no respite from these people with their rumbustious, drunken contentiousness." But Marx was quick to come to Imandt's defence, where he says, "If he takes part in their childish nonsense, he does so at most in a theoretical sense. Down here, Imandt lives the life of a sober, hard-working citizen." In Franz Mehring's biography of Marx, he accepts that the writer of Capital was not one to greet every new acquaintance as a friend and brother, but also claims that once a relationship was secure, Marx's loyalty to his friends was tantamount and firm. This was actually present in their very first meeting, where at the same Congress, Marx said to have repulsed men who would gladly have approached him with his intolerable arrogance. Marx also secured lifelong friends in the form of Imandt and Shelley. Drumca, interestingly, when he ends up in Glasgow, there's a later in a letter where they speak about how he's launched his own business and actually drew the ire of the Glasgow papers, who keep making vague references to people who start businesses without any start-up capital, and apparently Engels believes these are thinly veiled references to Drumca's venture. In 1855, Karl, Marx and Jenny suffered the loss of their son, Charles, who they affectionately termed Mush. Imandt was able to extend the kindness to Marx. Chased by his creditors and found in their surroundings coloured by grief, writing that the memory of our poor dear child torments us, they sought a new home. Imandt was at the same time heading north to Arbroath and Montrose to seek work. Marx wrote to Engels calling that a highly dubious prospect. Nevertheless, Imandt invited the family to take up residence at his cottage in Camberwell for the duration of his work in Scotland, and this was soon to be rendered indefinite. New surroundings certainly helped the family to begin to heal. On their arrival at the cottage, a letter of Jenny's about the children depicts the bleak circumstances the family were in. All their lovely little games have stopped. Their songs had fallen silent. The third person in their circle was missing. Their loyal, inseparable comrade, left with his happy jokes and games, with his wondrous ringing voice, which used to sing Scottish and Irish folk songs. And 5 years later, here in the northeast, our third part of the trio, Heinrich Heisa, also died. And his letters from the time are very brief between Marx and Engels on this subject. It seems like neither of them were particularly close to him, but certainly Imandt was. And I think that's sort of what interests me most about this somewhat mysterious man. There's numerous letters in the build-up to his death that say he's been drinking heavily and he's looking very ill, and it seems to have been somewhat expected, but certainly he and Imandt seemed to be quite inseparable, and it was actually a visit to Heisa up here in the northeast that prompted Imandt to move up here in the first place in some sense, and seek work in Angus. As far as I know, he stayed in these environs for the rest of his time alive, but he's a very hard man to track down because he doesn't have the sort of cultural clout that Imandt does through his public appearances that you often see mentioned in the Dundee Press. Now to another thing that sort of tantalises me is this question of whether Marx ever came to Dundee to visit his dear friend. In this letter from 1956, Imandt was clearly to play host to Marx. It says that he was to stay with him on the Cowgate, but we do know that at the last minute, Marx decided to go to Hull instead. And yet another time we lost out to Hull. But by this point, Imandt was well established in Dundee. Marx writes to Engels in 1956 to say that Imandt grumbles a great deal about the Scots, with whom it's impossible to have more than 12 lessons to teach them German, whatever ruses he adopts. But there does remain a suggestion that Marx did visit in 1859. W.O. Henderson, in his essay Marx in Manchester, certainly says so. He says, Marx was away from London for about 3 weeks in May, visiting Engels and Wolff in Manchester and Imandt and Heisa in Dundee. This appears to be seconded by Hal Draper in his Marx-Engels Chronicle, where in the subject of Das Volks financing, he states that M also talks about it to Imandt and Heisa in Dundee. The German language biography of Peter Imandt also claims Marx visited in 1859. So there we have 3 authors that make this claim. But I still feel like we're somewhat short of a definitive... we certainly know that Marx visited Scotland because he does, in the next letter that we have to Engels, he references Scotland, and a letter to LaSalle later that year, he says that he'd spent part of May in Scotland. But we don't know for certain that it was Dundee, although certainly the reason for the visit was, there seem to have been manifold reasons, but primarily he was seeking financing for his publication, Das Volk. Certainly Imandt, having been now established in Dundee, and would have seemed like a reasonable source, and we know that he was seeking to see them if they were here based in the northeast, and the only person in Glasgow was the third part of the trio, to which Marx did not have much time. I think there's a lot here that does make the case that he would have visited. We know that he arrived in Manchester on approximately, June, not May, on approximately the 12th of June, the day after the publication of Part 1 of his contribution to the Critique of Political Economy. He sent one recorded letter that we know of to the publisher from Manchester on the 22nd. From there he went to Scotland to meet with Imandt, arriving back in London around the 2nd of July. The first letter to Engels that we get afterwards is on the 14th of July, where he apologises for a long silence after 1 week where he had to scurry around like mad. on paper business, and one in which private matters obtruded. Yet in this letter, the subject of Imandt and Heisa is not touched on at all, despite the heavy focus on the new publication, and despite their habit of gossiping about their Scottish compatriots. This is as much as I've been able to turn up on this subject, and I'd love in the question and answer if anyone's got any ideas for how we can prove that this happened, because it really gets under my skin that we're so close to it, but not quite there. So, further to what Marx had said about Imandt struggling to teach the Scots German, he also writes about developments in his personal life. A letter to Engels in May 1860, he writes, "Imandt is marrying his landlady's daughter, a Scotswoman," and then quotes a German phrase which means, "and a nice district too." This comes from an old anecdote where a bereaved mother shares that her son has been killed in the war effort, and the answer is, "and in such a nice district too." But there does seem to be also a bit of yo-yoing in Imandt's personal life at this time. In 1860, Marx wrote that he had become a faller, and that he'd also grown thin as a rake, and he's been ill all summer and still is, poor devil. Curiously, the next time he's described, in 1862, he reports that Imandt has grown frightfully obese. It's almost as though a second back has formed on top of his old one. More in his family in 1870, Imandt's nephew Robert Imandt actually stayed with the Marx family when he was travelling between Paris and Dundee. Marx wrote to Peter and described him as a very sound and well-educated young man who's given us all immense pleasure. The next time he wrote, he asked after Bourbaki Jr., a reference to the French general who ran into trouble at the Swiss border. An 1858 letter from another Imandt nephew named Karl urges that Marx's family to visit next spring so that he might once again see the red-haired Laura and black-haired Jenny. Okay, and we will return to Peter Imandt at the end, but I want to briefly touch upon some other Dundonian characters that have links to the revolutions of 1848 and 1871. And the first one being David Wemyss Jobson, who's a really fascinating character that I don't ever really hear much about. He was a dentist to Queen Victoria at the start of his life, and to William IV before that. But then he was sacked in scandal after trying to gossip with the Queen during her dental work. Espousing intemperately the cause of the Lady Flora Hastings, whose death had caused a scandal in 1839. He actually became an author afterwards to sort of, after he'd fallen on hard times following the loss of his job here. But he would often say at the outbreak of the revolution in 1848, he went straight to France and ingratiated himself with Lamartine and other members of the provisional government, where he earned the honorary title of general despite no military training. And in the 1850s, after the revolution, he went to America, where he became more notorious further still. In 1858, he was in a New York court fighting over dentistry patents when Lola Montez here, courtesan to Ludwig I and scandalous celebrity over time, saw this opportunity to face down an old enemy and testify in the court to his evil character, where she remembered him as a rogue and a jailbird who'd blackmailed both her and her husband. On the stand, she said, "Dr. Jobson, who is Dr. Jobson? Are you a Dr. Jobson? How long since? You introduced yourself to me as Jobson, attorney of law, when we met in London." Later, she flared up like a rocket when asked how many intrigues she had had. "How many have you?" She demanded. "None. I resided at the court of Bavaria for 2 years. I knew the King of Bavaria." "Were you the mistress of the king?" Lola jumped up with a sweep of skirts. "What?" she exclaimed. "No, sir. You're a villain, for I take my oath on that book, which I read every night, that I had no intrigue with the old man. I knew the king and moulded his mind to the love of freedom. He took me before the whole court with his wife and presented me as his best friend. I was on the stage in Bavaria. It's much easier to be a man's mistress than a dancer." And, this is already quite a scandal in open court, but eventually it breaks into physical violence. Jobson objected to Lola's counsel, Frederick Seeley, referring to him as fellow. He says, "If you call me a fellow again, you vagabond shyster, I'll let you see." "You will," Seeley shouted back. "Say another word and I'll drop you down 3 stories from this window." The court soon descended into farce. A vicious fight broke out. Lola was asked afterwards if she had indeed uttered the expression, "Pommel him well, I would like to see him pommelled." This she denied. Jobson lost the case. He also lost his next high-profile case against Sir James Ferguson, the nephew of Lord Camperdown, over his inheritance. The Jobsons being a prominent landowning Dundee family at the time. But Jobson maintained for the rest of his life that Ferguson had conspired to have him institutionalised in New York in an asylum, and that the government and the aristocracy were to blame for his fate. When he eventually passed, doctors struggled to get an accurate picture of his life and circumstances due to the strength of his delusions. He died at 70. His autopsy revealed a serious brain condition, and he's buried on Hart Island in New York City. The second we have here is Emile L'Angelier. My pronunciation is terrible, I apologise. This is again a sort of scandalous court case of the era, and the victim in this case lived in Dundee for some years, which meant that a lot of Dundonian workers that had worked alongside Emile L'Angelier were interviewed in court. This is the case of Madeline Smith, who was accused of poisoning her lover, Emile, from the Channel Islands with arsenic, and the jury eventually returned a not proven verdict, and this was a very widely reported on case at the time. But Emile also is said to have participated in Paris in the Revolution of 1848, and this is Mr. Young of Dundee writing about what he would often say about his experiences there. "He told me about being in France at the Revolution. Did he mention to you about any injury he'd received there? He told me he felt very nervous after leaving France, which he attributed partly to the excitement of the occasion. He said he frequently heard a noise behind him, which he described like a number of rats following him. He was always very excited when he spoke about the lady who jilted him. I remember of his crying once on those occasions. He appeared to be in great grief. That was the first time he talked to me about destroying himself and of drowning himself." Another fascinating connection there to the Revolution. And the next one, Annie Gordon Baillie, is actually to the Paris Commune of 1871. And she's the subject of a great book, a sort of unbelievable larger-than-life book called The Adventures of a Victorian Conwoman, The Life and Crimes of Mrs. Gordon Baillie. This is but a footnote in her storied life, but she was also present in Paris and immediately after the Paris Commune, where she came into contact with a few other Dundonians who were living there at the time. Among the many people she met in Paris at this time was a gentleman from Dundee who, in a letter to the local newspaper, stated he knew her during 1872. As far as he understood, she was engaged in philanthropic work around prisons and came from Forfarshire, where her mother had a large estate named Lilybank. According to this gentleman, Annie and her brother had been travelling for some time. Annie and her brother drove about all day in a carriage, and both of them were always well dressed. When she left Paris, the correspondent continues, she told the hotel she would be back the following week, but would have to leave briefly because she'd received a telegram saying that her aunt had died. Before she left, she borrowed £2 from the correspondent's son-in-law. The gentleman was most surprised to bump into Annie not long afterwards, back in Dundee at the Kinnaird Hall. He mentioned the lady for whom she had obtained several articles was anxious to see her, and Annie promised to write to her, saying offhandedly that it was only a few callers. So yeah, 3 fascinating stories there that definitely merit more attention, but I'm going to have to zoom on, running away from myself here. Here's my work looking at the reaction to the Commune in the Dundee Press, during which it was often used to sell wares. This shop, James Spence, the tailors on the right here, their salesman was actually caught up in Paris during the Commune, and they say this in the advertisement, saying Mr. Robertson, during the revolt of last month, he managed to acquire an extensive arrival of rich black and coloured silks, shawls. And you've got this one on the left here as well, also says, all bought at revolution prices. This is actually, interestingly, the salesman, Mr. Robertson, ends up sort of being the correspondent for a while for the advertiser, and writing in about his observations of what he saw in Paris. And there's some really interesting extracts there as well. I like the part where he says, I wish I could send you 1 or 2 of the New Republican newspapers. They're rich and spicy, but not rare. More's the pity. The best example of this, I think, though, is this chap, Hugh Sutherland, who takes the fervent atmosphere of the time and the reporting on the Paris Commune and sort of twists it to his own ends in a really interesting way. When Dundee Town Council held a private banquet for the Princess Louise's wedding using public funds, Hugh took them to court. The journal asked, "Who's Mr. Hugh Sutherland, the client of Mr. Paul? We never heard of him before." He replied in epic fashion with this one-act play, "Hugh Sutherland ahoy!" Printed in the pages of the same paper, in which he discusses his origins amongst the Red Lichties of Arbroath. It says somewhere here, the Red Lichties of Arbroath, are they related to the Reds in Paris? Okay. And yeah, he rambles on about various subjects, but there's some fantastic extracts here. He says, "What on earth was that who asked in the papers the other day wha Hugh Sutherland was? I thought it was a gay bit of impudence, for everybody wha kens only him at all would ken wha Hugh Sutherland was. Well, it was that spearing body, the advertiser in People's Journal. He would spear the very internals out of you if he could, but he did not get much out of me. I only tell him I was a tailor, which is small in Piper's news. When asked, will you would need it be at the marriage feast, Hugh replies, 'Deed no, I was never asked. I dined off a penny a liver at home, while the magistrates, council and friends nearly burst themselves with luncheons. They tried to bribe me with money, but it was no go. Money would not tempt. But as I want to rise in business, I've induced to issue the following advertisement.'" And here we are. So it's just all an elaborate advertising technique, but what a way to do it. So there's actually a reference here to the Ladywell, which is a big controversy at the time, the water from the Ladywell, which was said to have too much chlorine. And this is one of the areas where you can see this sort of, the fact that the papers are so packed full constantly of news of the Commune and the Revolution is perhaps having an impact on the way people are understanding local events in some sense. A traveller writes in, "Why don't they now bottle up the atmosphere and send it to Glasgow for analysis? I'm quite certain that too would be condemned. Then they might attack the smoke nuisance and stop the mills or compel them to consume their own smoke. But no, they don't do so. I maintain that the Ladywell water is less pernicious to health as a beverage than the smoky, sulphurous atmosphere in which our Duke Lords compel us to live. Last summer, I believe hundreds would have perished, but not for the Ladywell." I would beg to remind our nabobs that there is always an end to the abuse of power, however nicely exercised, and that the time will come, in spite of them, when the Ladywell will again flow for the benefit of the public. But the most direct response to the Commune in Dundee seems to have actually been in politics and the founding of the Dundee Republican Club. And this also, inspired lively debates in the papers at the time. Here, a commenter named Anacarsis Klutz, after the now 100 years dead, but he writes that Mr. A.G. Anderson, hairdresser, must also fill a high place in the new republic. Shaving and shearing, or at least the superintending of the same, forms such a large part of the duty of the Robespierres and the Marats of other times that if the new republic at all resembles its predecessors, barbers must have a deal to do in shaving the aristocracy, as Mr. Odger would say. Mr. Bennet Shoemaker cannot also be passed over. To do so would be heresy against all-pervading faith in leather. As humans, uppers in the shape of privileged classes will be swept away, and man's sole claim to distinction will be his understanding. It is clear that one who has supplied so many people with understandings would be grossly misunderstood if he were left in obscurity." And it goes on to mention pretty much everyone that was at this meeting of the Republican Club. And one of the Republicans in the next issue replies to say, "He disdains the idea of a hairdresser, a shoemaker, or a labourer coming boldly forward and asserting his sincere and honest belief in a Republican form of government as being at once the cheapest and the best." But we come back around after this. This is, at the close of the Commune, 3 months later, someone reflects in the paper, "One may have many things to complain of just now, but certainly a scarcity of exciting news is not one of these. The most voracious dares not assert that there's nothing in the papers. In other experience, they were never fuller, scarcely ever so full of topics suitable for breakfast table chit-chat and club gossip." But I've only got about 5-10 minutes here, so I'll finish off by closing out our story of Peter Imandt, by now having secured his post, a German teacher at Dundee High. Traces of Imandt's life in Dundee that you see in the press paint quite a different picture from the one that you get from Marx and Engels in their letters. It did not take him long to earn respect and admiration in Dundee. In March 1857, there was already a complimentary supper held in his honour, during which he gave a talk on the cause of Italian independence and received toasts from friends and former students. As a teacher, the Dundee Courier reports that he won for himself the affection of his pupils, as well as secured the approbation of the parents. These he thought were the highest testimonials. He played an active part in the Dundee Chess Club. He kept an eye on local events. He's recorded present at political meetings, and there was one time an active force on the educational board. In 1862, he was able to poke fun at the Reverend George Gilfillan during a dinner held for William McLaren, advising him to begin taking German lessons, so to read Goethe and Schiller in the original, and therefore revise his arguments on their atheistic tendencies. Imandt also kept Marx aware of his reception in Dundee. In 1872, he thanked Marx for sending him a French translation of the first part of Capital, of which the German original had for years proven a hard nut to crack. It has been theorised that his lukewarm reception to Capital and delay in responding harmed their relationship somewhat, but in the same letter he notes that the Dundee Advertiser had called it an ouvrage de luxe on account of the pretty pictures. He passes on regards from Robert, now tutoring in Edinburgh, and tells how he is aged into an old Scottish schoolmaster who heartily greets you all. Upon his death, some years after Marx's own, the Courier featured 2 tributes that depict the schoolmaster not as a lout or a Philistine, but as a scholar, a sage, and a great man. An unnamed correspondent, who knew him well, wrote that he was not long in Dundee when it was discovered that there appeared among us a highly trained intellect of rare acuteness and penetration, cosmopolitan in its instincts, and capable of taking a wide survey of most of the subjects that interest humanity. Beyond his knowledge and talents as an educator, he was admired socially. His bonhomie, his joyousness of spirit, and his great conversational powers, notwithstanding the drawbacks of his having to impress himself in a language not familiar to him, and a certain abruptness of manner arising chiefly from his hatred of all pretense and sham, made him a welcome guest in social circles. The tribute does not sanitise his past or obscure his politics either. It says plainly, his reverence for the offer of capital was boundless, and one of his greatest treasures was a copy of Marx's masterpiece presented to him by the author himself. Given these qualities, it's no surprise that Imandt fostered a generation of radical students. The eulogy states, he soon became the centre of a band of young men in the town who took an interest in something higher than local politics. Here is his grave in Barnhill Cemetery, out near Bright Ferry. And here's me and Mike Arnott over there, posing for the 200th anniversary of his birth. We're releasing flowers. And on that occasion, I read from Cervantes' Numancia, which Imandt actually lectured on in Dundee, and in one of the few public appearances that we know about in some detail. And I read this passage, which I'll close out with. Our first concern must be this rampant vice, which like a canker spreads to curb and tame. For should it run unfettered in a trice, we bid farewell to good repute and fame. This damage must be cured at any price, for should we fail to quench its blazing flame, such vice alone would kindle fiercer war than all the foemen of this land by far. Okay, thank you very much.